Welcome. Tonight we drift into a warm desert evening, the air scented faintly with dust and paper, oil lamps flickering behind carved wooden doors, and the quiet murmur of scholars carrying on slow conversations in the courtyards of Bukhara. The city rests beneath a sky scattered with stars, its streets winding past libraries, mosques, markets, and the homes of men who believe knowledge itself is the greatest treasure a human can hold. It is beautiful, and it is demanding. Most people wouldn't last a week in this palace, where learning is not a hobby but a way of survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to share your location and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year 980, in a small village near Bukhara called Avicenna, a child is born who will one day be known as Ibn Sina, and much later in Europe as Avicenna. His father Abdullah is a respected official in the Samanid administration, a man who believes deeply in learning and intellectual discussion. His mother Satara is described as intelligent and steady, someone who quietly encourages her son's curiosity even when it leads him far beyond what most children of the time would ever encounter. The house where Ibn Sina grows up is not filled with toys, but with visitors, philosophers, clerks, mathematicians, wandering scholars who argue about the nature of the soul while sipping tea under fig trees. From an early age, the boy listens more than he speaks. He memorizes verses of the Quran with unusual speed, completing the entire text by the age of 10, a well-known historical fact that even his critics never disputed. His teachers are first impressed, then unsettled. He begins correcting them, politely, gently, as if he is simply asking questions, but always with unsettling accuracy. Arithmetic, geometry, logic, law, poetry, grammar, all come to him with ease. His father proudly invites more scholars to the house, turning dinner into nightly debates that stretch long past midnight. There is a quirky detail from these years. Ibn Sina becomes so absorbed in his studies that he sometimes forgets to eat, only realizing hours later when dizziness reminds him he still has a body. His mother is said to leave bread and fruit quietly beside his manuscripts, like offerings to a small, absent-minded god of knowledge. Bukhara itself is a living classroom. The Samanid capital is rich with culture. Its library is legendary. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript of his autobiography, Ibn Sina later recalls walking through rooms of books so vast he believed he could spend a lifetime and never touch the same subject twice. One particular royal library will soon change everything. By the time he is 16, Ibn Sina turns his attention seriously to medicine. He studies the existing texts, but finds them incomplete, scattered, unsatisfying. He begins observing real patients, noting symptoms, treatments, outcomes. He experiments carefully with herbs and diets, learning not just from books but from body. Before long, people begin seeking him out. This teenage physician starts curing illnesses that older doctors have failed to treat. Word spreads through the city with soft urgency. Then fate opens the palace doors. The Samanid emir, Ibn Mansur, falls gravely ill. Court physicians are baffled. Ibn Sina is summoned. He examines the ruler, proposes a treatment, and succeeds where others have failed. The emir recovers. In gratitude, he grants the young physician access to the royal library, the very heart of Bukhara's accumulated wisdom. Inside that library, Ibn Sina's life explodes into motion. He devours texts on medicine, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, music, and metaphysics. He reads Aristotle and Galen, Persian scholars and Indian treatises. He copies notes obsessively. Years later, he will say that everything he knows was formed during this period of reading, that the library itself was his true teacher. Historians still argue whether the exact size of the Samanid library was exaggerated by later writers, but all agree it was among the richest collections in the Islamic world. There is another little-known detail from these years. Ibn Sina develops a habit of reading by lamplight while pacing. Unable to sit still when ideas strike, he murmurs his thoughts aloud, startling servants who pass by in the corridors late at night. By 18, his reputation is established. By 20, he has surpassed most of his teachers. But this is not the peaceful rise of a sheltered genius. The political world around him is already shifting. The Samanid dynasty begins to weaken. Power struggles creep into the court. The library that fed his mind will soon be scattered by conquest. Still, in this first stage of his life, Ibn Sina stands at the center of a golden moment, a city of learning, a household of debate, a mind opening faster than the world can follow. He is not yet wandering, not yet imprisoned, not yet famous across continents. He is simply a boy who believes that if he studies long enough, every mystery of the universe will eventually grow tired and reveal itself. The collapse of the Samanid dynasty does not arrive with thunder or banners, but with paperwork, whispered arguments in narrow corridors, and the slow disappearance of familiar faces from the palace. As Ibn Sina enters his late teens and early 20s, the political world that once protected his education begins to crack. Officials flee. Salaries go unpaid. The great royal library, the one that shaped his mind, is eventually broken apart. Some of its books are sold, some stolen, some lost forever. Ibn Sina watches this quietly, already understanding that knowledge, no matter how powerful, is always fragile when politics shifts. With his father's death not long after, responsibility settles on his shoulders. He must support himself, and he does it the only way he knows how, with his mind and his growing medical reputation. He leaves Bukhara and begins moving between cities. Gorgan Shnishaper, Judujang, following opportunity, sometimes invited by rulers, sometimes arriving unannounced with only his books and confidant. It is during this period that his reputation as a teenage physician fully matures into something remarkable. Patients come from distant villages. Merchants, soldiers, court officials, and even minor nobles seek his treatment. One of the best-known historical facts from this period is that he officially practices medicine by age 16 and is considered an authority while still barely out of childhood. He does not rely on superstition or magic. He listens carefully, observes symptoms closely, and prescribes based on reasoned patterns. His success rate builds his fame. Yet for all his brilliance, he remains human. A quirky detail from these years survives in student recollections. Ibn Sina has an unshakable fondness for sweet pastries and often rewards himself with them after long study sessions. Claiming sugar kept his thinking sharp, he is also known to fall asleep over his manuscripts, ink still in his fingers, only to wake and continue writing mid-sentence as if no time has passed. In Jurgen he begins composing his first major philosophical and scientific works. He writes constantly during the day between patients and through the night under flickering lamps. When he grows stuck on a difficult problem, he walks until dawn, then returns to his desk with new clarity. If exhaustion overtakes him, he prays, sleeps briefly, and resumes. This rhythm of relentless thinking becomes his life. Historians still argue whether Ibn Sina's extreme productivity was driven more by natural genius or by fear of instability and loss after the fall of his early world. But his output during these years is extraordinary. His fame soon attracts the attention of regional rulers. Some offer patronage, others attempt control. He learns quickly that a brilliant mind is valuable currency in political games. He accepts positions reluctantly, always wary of being trapped in court politics. His first real political appointment comes in Hamadan, where he becomes court physician and later vizier to the Buyid ruler Shams al-Dawla. Here, his life changes again. Court life is not the peaceful environment of libraries and clinics. It is a place of jealousy, ambition, betrayal, and constant tension. Ibn Sina, more comfortable with manuscripts than ministers, struggles with intrigue. He treats the ruler's illnesses while navigating the anger of generals and bureaucrats who resent his influence. At one point, enemies at court orchestrate his dismissal and imprisonment. Even there, he does not stop writing. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript of his autobiography, Ibn Sina smuggles writing materials into his cell and continues composing works while confined. He dictates chapters to loyal students who memorize his words and transcribe them later. One of those works will become part of his most important legacy. Despite danger, exhaustion, and constant movement, these years solidify his identity: physician, philosopher, wanderer, and survivor. He is no longer simply the prodigy of Bukhara. He is becoming the mind that future centuries will call Avicenna. By the time Ibn Sina reaches his early 30s, life has taught him that brilliance alone is not enough to protect a person. In Hamadan, where he serves the Buyid ruler Shams al-Dawla, his medical skill keeps the court alive, but his independence earns him enemies. Soldiers resent him, courtiers whisper. Politics tightens around him like a slow, quiet storm. When Shams al-Dawla dies, the storm finally breaks. The new ruler, more suspicious and less impressed by philosophers, strips Ibn Sina of his position. Accusations rise. His movements are restricted. Before long, he is arrested and thrown into a fortress prison outside the city. This is not a symbolic confinement. The stone is cold, the air stale, the nights long. Most people would collapse under such pressure. Ibn Sina does the opposite. One well-known historical fact from this period is that he continues writing some of his most important works while imprisoned. With no formal library, he relies on memory. He reconstructs medical theories, philosophical systems, and logical arguments entirely from recall. Students secretly carry his words out of the prison, hiding manuscripts under clothing or memorizing entire chapters. A little-known detail: he trains himself to measure time in the cell by the angle of moonlight slipping across the stone floor, marking his writing hours without clocks or candles. Historians still argue whether his imprisonment strengthened his philosophical system by forcing him to rely purely on thought, or whether it nearly destroyed him and his later writings only masked the damage. Eventually, he is released, but the danger remains. Ibn Sina realizes he must leave Hamadan. He escapes in disguise, traveling as a wandering mystic and physician, hiding his identity while crossing dangerous territory. He reaches Isfahan, where he finds something he has not felt in years: stability. In Isfahan, under the protection of the ruler Ala al-Dawla, Ibn Sina finally breathes. The court values him for his mind, not his political usefulness. He is given space to write, teach, and think. Here, in calmer surroundings, he produces some of his greatest work. His daily routine becomes legendary. Mornings are spent treating patients. Afternoons are devoted to writing. Evenings to teaching. Nights to philosophy. He sleeps in fragments, fueled by tea, conversation, and that same quiet hunger for understanding that shaped him as a child in Bukhara. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, Ibn Sina's students describe him lecturing while walking, thinking while riding, composing while bathing, his mind never still, always forming new connections. This period becomes the most productive of his life. With Isfahan as his refuge, Ibn Sina finally experiences something close to peace, but it is a peace that still moves on horseback. Ila al-Dawlah's court is stable, yet surrounded by rival powers, and Ibn Sina often travels with the ruler on military campaigns, carrying books alongside medical instruments. Tents replace libraries, yet his work continues as steadily as if he was seated beneath carved ceilings. During these years of wandering scholarship, he writes constantly, even when the ground beneath him is uncertain. He composes on scraps of paper, on the backs of letters, on whatever surface can hold ink. When paper is scarce, he dictates entire chapters to students by firelight. The road becomes his classroom, the camp his study. One well-known historical fact from this period is that Ibn Sina writes more than 200 works in his lifetime, many of them during these traveling years, covering medicine, philosophy, logic, astronomy, music, and chemistry. Few scholars in history ever approach such breadth. A quirky detail preserved in student accounts describes him tying completed manuscript pages with strands of his own hair when no cord is available, joking that knowledge should be bound to the body of the one who creates it. Historians still argue whether the extreme pace of his writing was driven by genuine inspiration or by an unspoken fear that life would once again collapse without warning. Even during travel, students gather around him. He teaches openly, refusing rigid classrooms. Lessons unfold in courtyards beside rivers, in marketplaces. He believes understanding grows better when it breathes outside walls. He encourages questions, challenges assumptions, invites contradiction. His voice remains calm, patient, steady. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, Ibn Sina often tests his own theories directly on himself, adjusting his diet, sleep, and routine to study the effects on body and mind. He keeps careful records, treating himself as both physician and patient. Despite relative safety, danger never disappears. Armies march, cities burn, borders change. Ibn Sina moves with them, never settling for long, yet carrying within him a growing body of work that will soon shape the medical world forever. It is during the long, restless nights of these traveling years that Ibn Sina begins assembling the work that will define him for centuries. The Canon of Medicine. He does not conceive it as a single book at first. It grows slowly, page by page, patient by patient, idea by idea, until it becomes something vast and carefully ordered, like a map of the human body drawn by reason itself. One well-known historical fact is that the Canon of Medicine will later be used as the primary medical textbook in Europe and the Islamic world for over 600 years. Universities from Italy to Persia will teach from its pages. Physicians will swear by its structure, its clarity, its astonishing completeness. But here, in its earliest form, it is simply Ibn Sina at a desk, late at night, listening to wind across tents or the distant noise of soldiers, shaping knowledge into something that can survive him. The canon is revolutionary not because of isolated discoveries, but because of its system. Ibn Sina organizes medicine into causes, symptoms, diagnoses, treatments, and outcomes. He insists on testing remedies. He distinguishes between diseases that look alike but behave differently. He identifies contagious illness, including tuberculosis, and describes the importance of quarantine centuries before germ theory will exist. A quirky detail from these years, when a chapter finally feels complete, Ibn Sina rewards himself by playing music on a small lute he carries during travel, believing melody clears the mind and strengthens memory. Historians still argue whether some of the herbal treatments listed in the canon were based on experimentation or inherited tradition, but its clinical method remains strikingly modern. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, Ibn Sina writes parts of the canon while traveling on horseback, stopping suddenly when an idea forms, dismounting and scribbling before it fades. The work slowly becomes his anchor. Wherever he goes, the manuscript grows. And wherever the manuscript grows, Ibn Sina's place in history quietly solidifies. As the canon continues to expand, Ibn Sina's mind turns with equal force toward questions that medicine alone cannot answer. What is the soul? How does thought arise? Where does reason end and faith begin? These are not idle puzzles for him. They are structural pillars of existence itself. He begins developing what will become his most famous philosophical system, blending Aristotle with Islamic theology and his own original insights. He proposes that the human mind possesses levels of understanding, moving from raw sensation to pure intellect. He argues for the existence of a necessary being, a reality that must exist without cause, supporting everything else. His reasoning will influence thinkers for centuries, including Christian and Jewish philosophers who later encounter his works in translation. One well-known historical fact: medieval European scholars will refer to him simply as the philosopher, often without even using his name. A little-known detail from these years is that Ibn Sina sometimes writes philosophical chapters in code-like shorthand so only advanced students can follow his reasoning, protecting ideas he considers dangerous from careless misinterpretation. Historians still argue whether Ibn Sina-esque's concept of the soul was shaped more by Greek philosophy or by his own mystical experiences, which he rarely describes openly. His students now view him as more than a physician. He is a guide through existence itself. Lessons stretch deep into the night. Arguments grow intense, then dissolve into laughter, tea, and more writing, as mentioned earlier in the old manuscript. He often says that understanding reality is more difficult than curing the body, yet more necessary. Even as Ibn Sina's reputation soars, life continues to test him with harsh realities. Around his 40th year, political tensions flare again. He falls into conflict with local rulers who feel threatened by his influence and wisdom. Once more, imprisonment looms. This is no distant danger. It is immediate, physical, and chilling. Cold stones, narrow windows, and guards who watch every movement replace the comfort of libraries and students. Yet in these periods of confinement, Ibn Sina demonstrates a remarkable resilience. He continues writing, dictating works to his pupils or scribbling notes on scraps of paper hidden in clothing or behind walls. One well-known historical fact from this time is that some of his most sophisticated philosophical and scientific treatises were completed while he was technically a prisoner, proving that intellect can flourish even under extreme duress. A quirky detail: he is said to have tied small scraps of paper together and rolled them like tiny scrolls, then tucked them inside his robe, joking with himself that the prison walls could never hold the ideas. He would sometimes read aloud to himself in a low voice, pacing the cell, practicing arguments he would later publish. Historians still argue whether his time in confinement was a purely negative experience or whether it intensified his focus, pushing him to condense and refine ideas that might have otherwise taken decades to develop. Many scholars now lean toward the latter, seeing prison not as a limitation but as a crucible for his greatest mental achievements. Even under pressure, Ibn Sina remains human. He jokes quietly with trusted attendants, plays small games of logic and riddles to keep his mind sharp, and attends to basic medical treatments for fellow prisoners whenever he can. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, he writes about balancing body and mind carefully, often reminding himself that survival requires attention to both. This period shapes his philosophy as well as his medical approach. He develops deeper insights into the connection between the mind and body, observing the effects of stress, confinement, and diet on mental clarity. The canon and his philosophical works begin to intertwine subtly. The human being becomes a unified organism of thought and flesh, subject to both reasoning and experience. Eventually, fortune shifts again. Friends, patrons, and former students secure his release. The danger is not fully gone, but Ibn Sina has proven that intellect, curiosity, and persistence can survive conditions that would crush ordinary people. His legacy, both written and lived, is already quietly spreading. After his release from captivity, Ibn Sina settles once more in Isfahan, a city that now feels more like a home than any other place he has known. The city is quieter than Bukhara, the air scented with apricot blossoms in spring and dry clay in summer, and the streets hum with merchants, students, and travelers passing through. Here he begins what will be his final years of teaching, sharing knowledge with a new generation of students while his body quietly starts to show the wear of decades spent in travel, study, and hardship. He maintains a structured routine. Mornings are devoted to seeing patients, from wealthy merchants to the humblest townsfolk, and even to the occasional wandering traveler seeking his advice. Afternoons are for writing, revising, and expanding the Canon of Medicine and other treatises. Evenings are for philosophical discussion, often stretching late into the night under the soft glow of oil lamps, where the voices of students and teacher blend into a gentle murmur of curiosity and calm. One well-known historical fact: during these years, Ibn Sina's teaching becomes legendary, attracting pupils from across Persia, Central Asia, and beyond, many of whom will carry his methods and ideas to distant lands. A quirky detail from this period is that he keeps a small garden where he grows herbs, both for his medical experiments and for personal enjoyment. He reportedly talks to the plants, believing that calm observation helps him understand the subtle qualities of each herb. Students found it amusing but respected his rituals, noting that his concentration seemed to deepen after these quiet hours among the leaves. Historians still argue whether his garden work was purely experimental or whether it also served as a meditative practice. A momentary escape from the endless intensity of study and teaching. Regardless, it becomes part of his daily rhythm, a soft anchor in an otherwise busy life. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, Ibn Sina begins to feel the strain of age and illness. He teaches less physically, relying more on conversation and dictation, yet even weakened, his mind remains vibrant. He challenges students to think critically, to question assumptions, and to see medicine and philosophy not as separate disciplines but as parts of a connected, living universe. These years are quieter than the earlier chaos of court intrigue, imprisonment, and travel, yet they are perhaps the most profound. Ibn Sina consolidates a lifetime of knowledge into a coherent legacy, preparing both students and manuscripts for a future that he knows he may not see himself. Even as his body betrays him, his voice continues to guide, inspire, and shape minds, leaving a gentle but firm imprint on all who come into contact with him. As Ibn Sina moves deeper into his 50s, the signs of age and illness grow harder to ignore. His once tireless body begins to falter. His steps slow, his hands sometimes tremble over the pages he writes, yet his mind remains sharp, still able to reason through complex medical cases and philosophical dilemmas with clarity that astonishes his students. Death, though looming, does not erase the presence he has built across Persia and beyond. During this final period, his works begin to spread far beyond the cities he has lived in. The Canon of Medicine circulates quietly at first, copied by hand and shared among physicians. Word of his philosophical treatises moves along trade routes and scholarly networks, eventually reaching distant lands where translations into Latin and other languages will secure his posthumous fame. One well-known historical fact: by the time he dies in 1037, Ibn Sina has established a lasting legacy, with his medical and philosophical works serving as reference points for centuries across the Islamic world and Europe. A little-known detail is that, even on his sickest days, he continues to write short notes and instructions for students, sometimes dictating while barely able to sit upright. He worries about unfinished manuscripts, fearing that valuable knowledge might be lost if he does not find a way to pass it on. His concern for continuity is so intense that he devises systems for students to memorize entire sections of his work, a kind of intellectual insurance against the fragility of paper and ink. Historians still argue about the precise circumstances of his death, with some suggesting a combination of long-term illness and exhaustion from decades of relentless study, while others emphasize the harsh conditions of his early travels and imprisonment as contributing factors. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, Ibn Sina reflects on the impermanence of life and the permanence of ideas, urging his students to continue inquiry, to question boldly, and to balance study with self-care. Even in his final days, he teaches, reminding them that knowledge is not static but a living conversation across generations. His passing is marked with both sorrow and celebration. Scribes, students, and physicians gather quietly to honor his life. Stories of his wisdom, humility, and extraordinary memory are recounted, ensuring that the human behind the manuscripts is remembered alongside the works themselves. By the time the body rests, the ideas have already begun their journey, moving outward, touching distant cities, and inspiring countless thinkers yet to come. Even after Ibn Sina's passing, his influence radiates outward like ripples on a calm pond. The Canon of Medicine becomes a cornerstone text in universities from Cordoba to Venice. Students learn anatomy, diagnosis, and treatment through his methods. His philosophical works, once whispered in small study circles, are translated into Latin, Hebrew, and later European languages, shaping scholastic thought, metaphysics, and natural philosophy for generations. One well-known historical fact is that Avicenna's writings were a standard reference in European medical schools well into the 17th century, centuries after his death. A quirky detail: some European scholars, translating his texts, misinterpreted certain Arabic terms, believing, for example, that mandrake root had mystical properties beyond Ibn Sina's medical intention. Yet even these mistakes added layers to his legend, blending science and folklore into a kind of enduring mythos. Historians still argue how much his works influenced figures such as Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, or even later Renaissance thinkers, since much of the transmission was indirect, through translations and commentaries. Nevertheless, the reach of his ideas is undeniable, bridging cultures, languages, and religions. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript, Ibn Sina's approach emphasized observation, reason, and careful analysis, whether dealing with the pulse of a patient or the movement of the stars. These principles form a thread connecting medical practice, philosophical inquiry, and scientific method, laying foundations for centuries of intellectual exploration. His legacy is not only in texts but in the model of a life lived in pursuit of understanding. Physicians and philosophers alike emulate his methods, his commitment to continuous learning, and his insistence that knowledge is a living, breathing thing. Across continents, the name Avicenna evokes both awe and quiet admiration. His ideas continue to ripple, not merely as abstract concepts but as practical tools, guiding diagnosis, treatment, teaching, and reasoning long after the man himself is gone. The reach of his mind stretches into classrooms, libraries, and lecture halls centuries later. Yet behind the monumental legacy, there was a boy in Bukhara pacing under the moonlight, whispering questions into the quiet night. And in that gentle beginning, the story of human curiosity, resilience, and brilliance continues to unfold, echoing softly for anyone willing to listen. Imagine the young boy in Afshana clutching a handful of ink-stained papers, walking barefoot across dusty courtyards, his thoughts already far beyond the walls of his home. Picture him pacing beneath the soft light of oil lamps, a cup of tea beside him, murmuring questions and answers to himself until the night grows old. These small, quiet moments are as essential to his story as the grand works that later made him immortal. Through decades of travel, political tension, and imprisonment, Ibn Sina remained remarkably human, curious, playful, sometimes forgetful, yet endlessly determined. He wrote, he taught, he healed, and he thought, always attentive to the fragile balance between body and mind, between intellect and experience. There were failures, threats, long nights of exhaustion, and moments when the world seemed to collapse around him, and yet he persisted, carefully shaping knowledge into forms that would survive him, even when the streets he walked changed or the rulers who protected him faded into history. In the end, his legacy is more than medicine or philosophy. It is the quiet example of a life lived in pursuit of understanding, in the belief that thought, observation, and careful reasoning can bridge centuries. Today, his ideas continue to echo, not only in classrooms and libraries, but in the spirit of inquiry that every student, physician, or philosopher carries forward. So as you rest, imagine Ibn Sina in the stillness of his study, surrounded by scrolls and the soft flicker of lamps, his mind alive and curious, undimmed by the passage of centuries. Let the rhythm of his life, the patient observation, the steady writing, the quiet reflection wash over you like a gentle tide.